The Baldwin Locomotive Works was an American builder of railroad locomotives. It was originally located in Philadelphia, and later moved to nearby Eddystone, Pennsylvania. Although the company was very successful as the largest producer of steam locomotives, its transition to the production of diesels was far less so. Later, when the early demand for diesel locomotives to replace steam tapered off, Baldwin could not compete in the marketplace. It stopped producing locomotives in 1956 and went out of business in 1972, having produced over 70,000 locomotives, the vast majority powered by steam. This company is not to be confused with the M. Baldwin of Australia, who made small locomotives for such things as sugarcane tramways. History: 19th century. Beginning. The Baldwin Locomotive Works had a humble beginning. Matthias W. Baldwin, the founder, was a jeweler and whitesmith, who, in 1825, formed a partnership with a machinist, and engaged in the manufacture of bookbinders' tools and cylinders for calico printing. Baldwin then designed and constructed for his own use a small stationary engine, the workmanship of which was so excellent and its efficiency so great that he was solicited to build others like it for various parties, and thus led to turn his attention to steam engineering. The original engine was in use and powered many departments of the works for well over 60 years, and is currently on display at the Smithsonian Institution in Washington, D.C. In 1831, at the request of the Philadelphia Museum, Baldwin built a miniature locomotive for exhibition which was such a success that he received that year an order from a railway company for a locomotive to run on a short line to the suburbs of Philadelphia. The Camden and Amboy Railroad Company had shortly before imported a locomotive from England, which was stored in Bordentown, New Jersey. It had not yet been assembled by Isaac Drips when Baldwin visited the spot. He inspected the detached parts and made notes of the principal dimensions. Aided by these figures, he commenced his task. The difficulties attending the execution of this first order were such that they are not easily understood by present-day mechanics. Modern machine tools simply did not exist. The cylinders were bored by a chisel fixed in a block of wood and turned by hand. The workman had to be taught how to do nearly all the work, and Baldwin himself did a great deal of it with his own hands. It was under such circumstances that his first locomotive, christened Old Ironsides, was completed and tried on the Philadelphia, Germantown and Norristown Railroad on November 23, 1832. It was at once put in active service, and did duty for over 20 years. It was a four-wheeled engine, weighing a little over 5 tons. The driving wheels were 54 inches in diameter, and the cylinders were of 9.5 inches bore by 18 inches stroke. The wheels were of heavy cast-iron hubs, with wooden spokes and rims, and wrought iron tires, and the frame was made of wood placed outside the wheels. It had a 30 inches diameter boiler which took 20 minutes to raise steam. Top speed was 28 miles per hour. Early years. Baldwin struggled to survive the Panic of 1837. Production fell from 40 locomotives in 1837 to just 9 in 1840, and the company was heavily in debt. As part of the survival strategy, Matthias Baldwin took on 2 partners, George Vail and George Hufty. Although the partnerships proved relatively short-lived, they helped Baldwin pull through the economic hard times. Zera Colburn was one of many engineers who had a close association with Baldwin Locomotive Works. Between 1854 and 1861, when Colburn went to work more or less permanently in London, England, the journalist was in frequent touch with M. W. Baldwin, as recorded in Zera Colburn, The Spirit of Darkness. Colburn was full of praise for the quality of Baldwin's work. In the 1850s, railroad building became a national obsession, with many new carriers starting up, particularly in the Midwest and South. While this helped drive up demand for Baldwin products, it also increased competition as more companies entered the locomotive production field. Still, Baldwin had trouble keeping pace with orders, and in the early 1850s began paying workers piece rate pay. Taking advantage of human nature, this increased incentives and productivity. By 1857, the company turned out 66 locomotives and employed 600 men. But another economic downturn, this time the Panic of 1857, cut into business again. Output fell by 50% in 1858. The Civil War at first appeared disastrous for Baldwin. According to John K. Brown in the Baldwin Locomotive Works, 1831–1915, a study in American industrial practice. At the start of the conflict, Baldwin had a great dependence on Southern railways as its primary market. In 1860, nearly 80% of Baldwin's output went to carriers in states that would soon secede from the Union. As a result, Baldwin's production in 1861 fell more than 50% compared to the previous year. However, the loss in Southern sales was counterbalanced by purchases by the U.S. military railroads and the Pennsylvania Railroad, which saw its traffic soar, as Baldwin produced more than 100 engines for carriers during the 1861–1865 war. By the time Matthias Baldwin died in 1866, his company was vying with Rogers Locomotive and Machine Works for the top spot among locomotive producers. By 1870, Baldwin had taken the lead, and a decade later, it was producing 2.5 times as many engines as its nearest competitor, according to the U.S. manufacturing census. In 1897, the Baldwin Locomotive Works was presented as one of the examples of successful shop management in a series of articles by Horace Lucien Arnold. The article specifically described the piece rate system used in the shop management. Burton commented that, in the Baldwin Locomotive Works, piecework rates are seldom altered. Some rates have remained unchanged for the past 20 years, and a workman is the more highly esteemed when he can, by his own exertions and ability, increase his weekly earnings. He has an absolute incentive to increase his output as much as he possibly can, because he knows that he will not, by increasing his own income, lead to cutting piecework rates, and so be forced to make still further exertions in order to maintain the same weekly wage. History, 20th century. Initially, Baldwin built many more steam locomotives at its cramped 196 acres Broad Street, Philadelphia shop, but would begin an incremental shift in production to a 616 acres site located at Spring Street in nearby Eddystone, Pennsylvania in 1906. Broad Street was constricted, but even so, it was a huge complex, occupying the better part of 8 square city blocks from Broad to 18th Streets and Spring Garden Street to the reading tracks just past Noble Street. Eddystone, on the other hand, was spread out over 600 acres. Its capacity was well over 3,000 locomotives per year. The move from Broad Street was completed in the late 1920s. Gilded Age. The American railroad industry expanded significantly between 1898 and 1907, with domestic demand for locomotives hitting its highest point in 1905. Baldwin's business boomed during this period while it modernized its Broad street facilities. Despite this boom, Baldwin faced many challenges, including the constraints of space in the Philadelphia facility, inflation, increased labor costs, labor tensions, the substantial increase in the size of the locomotives being manufactured, and the formation of the American Locomotive Company, an aggressive competitor which eventually became known simply as ALCO. From 1904, Baldwin and Westinghouse marketed Baldwin-Westinghouse electric locomotives and A.C. electrification of railroads, particularly to the New Haven Railroad. In 1906, the Hepburn Act authorized greater governmental authority over railroad companies, and revitalized the Interstate Commerce Commission, which stepped up its activities. The ICC was given the power to set maximum railroad rates, and to replace existing rates with just and reasonable maximum rates, as defined by the ICC. The limitation on railroad rates depreciated the value of railroad securities, and meant that railroads stopped ordering new equipment, including locomotives. This may have been a factor in precipitating the Panic of 1907, which in turn disrupted finance and investment in new plants. Both of these events had a direct negative effect on the railroad industry, especially the locomotive builders. Baldwin's locomotive output dropped from 2,666 in 1906 to 614 in 1908. The company cut its workforce from 18,499 workers in 1907 to 4,600 the following year. Baldwin's business was further imperiled when William P. Hensley, one of Baldwin's partners, died. His death left Baldwin with a US $6 million liability. In response, Baldwin Incorporated and released US $10 million worth of bonds. Samuel Vauclin wanted to use these funds to expand Baldwin's capacities so it would be prepared for another boom. While other Baldwin officers opposed this expansion, Vauclin's vision won out. Baldwin would continue to expand its Eddystone plant until its completion in 1928. By 1928, the company moved all locomotive production to this location, though the plant would never exceed more than one-third of its production capacity. World War I. Baldwin was an important contributor to the Allied war effort in World War I. Baldwin built 5,551 locomotives for the Allies, including separate designs for Russian, French, British and United States trench railways. Baldwin built railway gun carriages for the United States Navy and manufactured 6,565,355 artillery shells for Russia, England and the United States. From 1915 to 1918, Remington Arms subcontracted the production of nearly 2 million pattern 1914 Enfield and M1917 Enfield rifles to the Baldwin Locomotive Works. After the end of World War I, Baldwin continued to supply export orders, as the European powers strove to replace large numbers of locomotives worn out by the war effort, and European locomotive factories were still retooling from armaments production back to railroad production. In 1919 and 1920, Baldwin supplied 5046 locomotives to the Palestine Military Railway that became the Palestine Railways H-class. Decline. After World War I, Baldwin's business would decline as the diesel engine became the standard on American railways. By the 1920s, the major locomotive manufacturers had strong incentives to maintain the dominance of the steam engine. Nevertheless, ALCO, while remaining committed to steam production, pursued R&D strategies in the 1920s and 30s that would ensure its competitiveness in the event that diesel locomotives would predominate. In contrast, Baldwin opposed any development of diesel locomotive technology in the 1930s. In 1930, Samuel Vauclin, chairman of the board, stated in a speech that advances in steam technology would ensure the dominance of the steam engine until at least 1980. Baldwin's vice president and director of sales stated in December 1937 that sometime in the future, when all this is reviewed, it will be found that our railroads are no more dieselized than they electrified. Baldwin had deep roots in the steam locomotive industry, and may have been influenced by heavy investment in its Eddystone plant. In 1928, the owners of the Gilded Whitcomb Company, a small manufacturer of gasoline and diesel industrial locomotives in Rochelle, Illinois, approached Baldwin with an invitation to participate in a recapitalization program. Baldwin accepted and purchased about half of the issued stock. In return, Baldwin assisted the company, but by March 1931 the small firm was in financial trouble and Baldwin filed a voluntary bankruptcy for Whitcomb, with Baldwin gaining complete control and creating a new subsidiary, the Whitcomb Locomotive Company. This action would lead to both financial losses and an ugly court battle between Baldwin and William Whitcomb, the former owner of the company. Baldwin began an attempt to diversify its product line in 1929, but the Great Depression thwarted these efforts and Baldwin declared bankruptcy in 1935. When Baldwin emerged from bankruptcy in 1938, it underwent a drastic change in management. The new management was dedicated to diesel power, but the company was already too far behind. Business declined drastically in the post-war years as EMD and ALCO seized the bulk of the diesel market from Baldwin, Lima Hamilton and Fairbanks Morse. In 1939, Baldwin offered its first standard line of diesel locomotives, all designed for yard service. By this time, General Motors had already marketed its first diesel road freight locomotive, World War II, in 1941. The United States' entry into World War II destroyed Baldwin's diesel development program when the War Production Board dictated that ALCO and Baldwin produce only steamers and diesel-electric yard-switching engines. Electromotive Division was assigned the task of producing road freight diesels, which might plausibly have given the latter a distinct advantage over its competitors in that product line in the years that followed World War II, due to the head start in diesel R&D and production. However, longtime GM leader Alfred P. Sloan presented a timeline in his memoir that belies this assumption, saying that GM's diesel engine R&D efforts of the 1920s and 1930s, and its application of model design standardization and marketing lessons learned in the automotive industry, were the principal reason for EMD's competitive advantage in the late 1940s and afterward. In his telling, the R&D needed to adapt earlier diesels to locomotive use was a capital-intensive project that almost no one among the railroad owners or locomotive builders was willing or able to invest in during the 1920s and 1930s, save the people of Winton Electromotive and Charles F. Kettering of the GM Research Corporation. During World War II, Baldwin's contributions to the war effort included not only locomotives and switches but also tanks. Baldwin was one of the manufacturers of several variants of the M3 tank and later the M4 Sherman. A Baldwin subsidiary, the Whitcomb Locomotive Company, produced hundreds of 65-ton diesel-electric locomotives for the Army and received the Army Navy Award for production. Baldwin ranked 40th among United States corporations in the value of wartime production contracts. And between 1940 and 1948, domestic steam locomotive sales declined from 30% of the market to 2%. By 1949, there was no demand for steam locomotives. In July 1948, Westinghouse Electric, which had teamed with Baldwin to build diesel and electric car bodies, purchased 500,000 shares, or 21%, of Baldwin stock, which made Westinghouse Baldwin's largest shareholder. Baldwin used the money to cover various debts. Westinghouse Vice President Marvin W. Smith became Baldwin's president in May 1949. In a move to diversify its operations, Baldwin merged with Lima Hamilton on December 4, 1950, to become Baldwin Lima Hamilton. However, market share continued to dwindle. By January 1952, Baldwin closed its factory in Rochelle and consolidated Whitcomb production at Eddystone. In 1953, Westinghouse discontinued building electrical traction equipment, and so Baldwin was forced to purchase electrical equipment from General Electric. In 1956, the Pennsylvania Railroad, which was slow in accepting diesels, finally decided to retire its steam fleet, which was the largest in the world at the time, and buy a large order of diesels. Baldwin bid, expecting its lifelong loyal customer to help keep Baldwin in business by buying at least some Baldwin diesels. General Motors' EMD division, however, gave the PRR an exceptional deal on new, reliable GP9s, so the PRR, which was in a financial pinch itself, sent the business to GM. This one-loss deal proved to be the end of the line, and after 125 years of continuous production, Baldwin closed most of its Eddystone plant. It produced no more locomotives after 1956, instead concentrating on heavy construction equipment. More than 70,500 locomotives had been produced when production ceased in 1956. In 1965, Baldwin became a wholly owned subsidiary of Armour & Company. Greyhound Corporation purchased Armour & Company in 1970, and in 1972 Greyhound closed Baldwin Lima Hamilton for good.